But I'm very proud to be here because this has been a wonderful conference and a very empowering conference for gender equity, for women, but also for all of us men who are here, who are also learning in the process. Let me try to make just a couple of final comments, and I'll be brief because the richness was in the panels and in the workshops we had today. And let me use a little bit the approach that Guy Berger from UNESCO used. The 4 principles of UNESCO or the Rome. I'll change the order a little bit, but the first one is the rights-based approach. This is what I tried to say the first day, and this is at least my function coming as a human rights expert and not a technology expert. But I strongly believe that anything we do, but especially anything in the world of public policy, should have a rights-based approach. Whether it be communication, any form of communication, and now the new technologies of internet, or whether it be development, and all the strategies of development, and all the alternatives of development, and the necessary elements of development like gender equity and non-discrimination against any group, all have to be based on a human rights focus, on a exercise rights focus. And this is crucial because when the CGI, the General sort of Council, Comité Gestor de Internet in Spanish, in Brazil, began their work, the multi-stakeholder dialogue institution they came to the same conclusion. They drafted 10 principles. But the first principle was we should have a human rights approach. Because as I was saying at the beginning, human rights is the one unifying element around the world. I say this with pain because I recognize at the first day that human rights are systematically being violated around the world. But human rights standards do exist. They are unchallengeable, they're growing, and they're being developed. And this is crucial, and we have to stick to these standards, and we have to demand that these human rights standards be upheld. This is what gives us the fundamental right to protect equal dignity of every single human being. And it's that equal dignity we all have, regardless of where we're born, regardless of our gender, or our sexual options and preferences, or our race, nationality, culture, language, or economic origin. We all will have always the same dignity and therefore the same rights. And I think this has to be reflected today in the internet by the accessibility of the internet. And with that, I jumping the order, into access. This conference was based on 2 basic questions: access to internet and gender equity. Fundamental issues around the world today. Access, because as I mentioned to you, when I began discussing in the mandate of freedom of expression in Geneva, accessibility in one of my first reports, people thought I was crazy because it was very much a Geneva-oriented debate, and it was like a given, anyone who wants to have access can have access. But this is not the truth. Access is relatively limited. When I did my report, India was one of the biggest powers of research and technology, had 7% of the population interconnected at that moment. And China, on the other hand, who was limiting content, but was developing the network, had already 375 million people interconnected. This was several years ago, so I don't know what the exact total today is. But that in those days was 1/4 of their population or more, and the fastest growing connectivity. So I kept on saying we have to look at access, both in terms of connectivity and equipment and software and all the services, and we also have to look at access in terms of access to full content without censorship. And this was the 2 angles of access. And today we see how this access is being limited for socioeconomic reasons, because there are many problems still around the world to make internet available in the most remote, distant areas, although we have the new mobile telephone technologies, but that actually give a limited form of access to internet. But we also have the prejudices of the past, and especially the accessibility to women. In some cases because of cultural misconceptions, in other cases because of legal limitations and discrimination, in other cases for structural issues, like the fact that they're limited to education from the beginning. or that there is an imposition of authority by the husband or by the father. So it is very important to look at these issues today. If we're going to look at the accessibility of internet, this is an issue that we cannot absolutely ignore. Access to internet will depend on also breaking the gender barrier, on generating really equality of rights among women and men. And I'm very pleased that Henrietta on the first day said, and we must also recognize the discrimination of women and limiting access to internet of women is not only a question of freedom of expression, it's not only a question of one technology, it's part of a global structural problem. So there's no way we can look just at internet in an isolated way if we don't look at it from all the development perspectives and really struggle against all forms of gender inequality and gender discrimination in our societies. So this is another call to engage with internet in seriously the development process initiated again or renewed by the UN, but with this gender focus specifically on it and the non-discrimination element to it. This accessibility is also being limited, as I said, for cultural reasons. It's being limited by legal reasons. In some countries, by law, there's limitations for women. But it's also being limited legally today on questions of national security. Some people are arguing that there's a conflict between freedom of expression, communication in these technologies and defending national security. And there is a problem of surveillance. And I think this is important also to develop. I believe in national security. I did a report on privacy, and I said national security is certainly a major concern of all of us. Of course we want to live in safe and secure nations. And of course there is a threat in the world, either of terrorism or of organized crime in some other countries, Latin America, for instance, drug dealers. And yes, we have many confrontations. And national security is not only a legitimate activity of the state, it's an obligation of the state. But national security does not contradict human rights. On the contrary, national security is part of the democratic form of society and of government. If you establish a relatively clear and transparent due process for doing it. Guy told us today that in UNESCO, for instance, all states have said systematically there has to be oversight of surveillance. Well, if the states have ratified that, let's keep them accountable to that. Let's see what are the oversight mechanisms of surveillance in every single country. My position in my paper, there has to be an authorizing institution, entity, hopefully a judge, but oftentimes because of the quantity of issues we're talking about today, it may not necessarily be a judge. But let's still look at this as an authorizing entity that will be different from those that will practice and develop the surveillance. And then you also need an oversight authority. And this will generate the checks and balances that any democratic society needs. What is not possible is that in the name of security, everyone will suffer surveillance. And who knows? I mean, the technology is going so fast that that may be the case someday. But certainly that is not in principle the reality that we should live under. That everything will be known by those in power, because regardless of what country of the world, I'm not speaking of any particular country in any particular continent, any particular nation, but the fact of the matter is that the protection of freedom of expression has always existed because there's a fear that if we allow the state to censor on the basis of any reason, on the basis of religion, on the basis of ideology, on the basis of security, if there is some form of censorship or intervention or surveillance that is unlawfully done, then ultimately you will have authoritarian types of regime. And this is not what we want. I think this is important for women also to understand, because part of the patriarchal society is keeping those structures of domination. So in a way, ultimately, the equity of women, or women equity and the rights of women are also dependent on the fact that we have to democratize all our societies in different ways and in different forms. Then in the Rome, we talked about openness. Openness of the net means openness to all people in all the parts of the world. And of course, This means net neutrality, means the possibility of understanding cultural diversity. Yesterday and this morning, people mentioned linguistic diversity as an important issue. And this is a call to the responsibility of corporations to the extent possible, because of course sometimes economically it may be unviable, but to the extent possible we should all try to seek the possibility of having internet in all languages, in all scripts, and relative to all cultures of the world. And this is important. This is part of the universality of rights, but also the universality of respect for cultural diversity, which I believe is a richness in the world and should not be a limitation for any form of communication. And this is where net neutrality, which oftentimes states don't even want to mention in the resolutions at the UN, is crucial. And finally, we have the multi-stakeholder dialogue, the multi-stakeholderism, some people call it. And this, I think it's an interesting approach. There has been in the UN several moves, as I mentioned yesterday, whether to move it to the ITU, which would make it a voting process. I don't think internet can be decided by a vote. It's not a simple vote issue. Not all countries are contributing the same to internet. Not all countries have the same technological capability. Not all countries are equally democratic in the way they allow the use of internet. And as a matter of fact, some countries are exercising repressive policies against bloggers, and there's many bloggers in jail, and many women being persecuted and suffering hostility and violence, as you mentioned this morning, over the internet, just because they want to express themselves freely and express their thoughts, their ideas, or their sexuality over internet. So obviously, the multi-stakeholder dialogue is crucial, I think, and essential. But not all states may be willing to. And here's where we really have to analyze how we build into this. I always use the example of Brazil because I said Brazil did something very important in this case, which was to institutionalize it. They actually created the CGI.br as an institution, a state institution with their own funds and their own absolute autonomy and independence. They drafted the 10 principles, and now the 10 principles came a policy, and then they even made propositions for the Ley de Marco Civil, the civil framework law. So I think it's important to have a multi-stakeholder dialogue if you have some degree of having an impact in public policies, if you have the possibility of changing the reality and the nature of the use of internet in our societies. This is particularly important for women. This is where women have to raise their voices. There has to be a gender focus in all this multi-stakeholder dialogue. And this is something we can raise at the IGF in Joao Pessoa this year. Because even the IGF has become a wonderful, important, excellent forum, but a forum that we can get used to very easily year after year after year of having hundreds of panels and debates, with the good effect of bringing up to date the debate of different issues, from technology to human rights, but not having any impact in transforming the reality of the countries or the legal approach to the countries. I strongly believe, and I really regret to say this, but I strongly believe we're living a downturn. As I said at the beginning, history always moves ahead and forward, but it goes by waves, and we're in a downturn in terms of human rights. We are looking at more repressive regimes, and we're looking at a regression in laws and a more limiting aspect of laws. So this is the moment when, instead of lamenting the situation, our position has to be a position of engagement, which is why I was so profoundly motivated by all the voices of women I heard here today. The power and the strength you have, and the possibilities of change. This, I think, is probably one of the big consequences of this conference. It is the link of the use of internet, number one, to development. Number two, because there can be no development without access to freedom of expression and access to information. And that today means access to connectivity and internet. And secondly, in this access breaking, probably the biggest element of discrimination and barrier in the world, which is the gender inequality and discrimination. I think this is very important. I was discussing with Guy today that in the Millennium Goal number 16 and in the paragraph 10 of that Millennium Goal 16, they did recognize the need to create public access to information and protection of fundamental freedoms. I'm even a bit critical. I'm very happy it's there. But I lament that it took them quite a while to think about it. They put it in the right place because it's related to access to justice and to guarantee of justice and peace. UNESCO says in its constitution that it's an institution that was established to promote peace in the world by facilitating the free flow of ideas and knowledge among peoples of the world. This is very important. The free flow of ideas and knowledge among peoples is what generates peace. So to counter hate speech, to counter discrimination, to counter racial obscenities and speech, we need positive speech. We need a free flow of ideas and knowledge among peoples of the world and a better understanding. And I think this is crucial, and I'm very pleased that it's there, hidden in little paragraph 10, but it's there. And it was very important. I think it took the states a lot of consideration to be able to negotiate this little paragraph, but we do have access to information as one of the crucial elements. And with this, let me finish that I'm very pleased to be here in the Stockholm Internet Forum again. For many years I've been part of this. And this time linked to the policies of development and gender equity. And a year from now will be the 250th anniversary of the first access to information law, which was passed in Sweden and Finland. So I think it's very relevant to be here, celebrating the next year, the 250th anniversary of the access to information law. But it's also very relevant to be today talking about internet and gender equity after the UN has just approved the Sustainable Development Goals, where goal number 16 clearly says that the world needs peace and justice to be able to have development. Justice means non-discrimination and gender equity, and it also means full access to information and respect for fundamental freedoms.